IDC Radio, 106.2 FM. IDC Radio, in collaboration with כל ישראל.
IDC International Radio, 106.2 FM, from Israel to the world. From Israel to the world.
You're listening to 106.2 FM IDC International Radio. I'm Itai Hanman, and with me in studio today is Henrique Cymerman, a Middle East correspondent, author, international affairs expert, works for several news outlets throughout the world in 5 different languages: Portuguese, Spanish, English, Hebrew, and French. Works mainly in Israel for Channel 2 News, has won several awards. The Anti-Defamation League has honored him with the Daniel Pearl Award. He has received the Conde de Godot Award from Spain, which is the equivalent to their Pulitzer Prize. And most recently, and very interestingly, the Angel of Peace token from Pope Francis. Very, very, very honored to have you here in studio, Mr. Cymerman. How are you doing today?
It's a pleasure, Itai.
It really is a pleasure to have you in studio. Let's kick things off with some of the things that you deal with. And you have covered so many stories spanning several decades. I want to get into this particular story with you, Daniel Pearl, how you were invited or how you received the honor from the ADL in getting the Daniel Pearl Award.
Well, you know, I always, like everyone, I heard the drama, the story of this incredible journalist, Daniel Pearl, many years ago. And for 3 years, I tried to reach, like he did, Al-Qaeda people, mainly the son of Osama bin Laden. His name is Omar Osama bin Laden, and he lives in Saudi Arabia part of the time, but most of the time in Qatar. And I was trying to get him for 3 years. It was really complicated, and we wrote many mails, etc. And finally, when everything was done and we were supposed to meet in Paris, one day he said to me, "I can't come, I didn't get a visa." He said to me, "Imagine if I'm in the airport and somebody say, Mr. Bin Laden, à l'information." It would be. So finally, I thought everything was done and it wouldn't happen. And I was supposed to do a story about Al Jazeera in Qatar. You know, it's a big story, Al Jazeera, and I was supposed to become, I think, one of the first since the Arab revolutions to go inside Al Jazeera and to speak with people and to see how they influence the Arab revolutions, the so-called Arab Spring. And then I just remembered that Bin Laden lives in Qatar part of the time. I wrote him a mail and he said, "This evening we have a meeting at 9 o'clock in this and this hotel." Then I was crazy because really he changed the hotel 9 times, I think. But finally we met, and I was trying to convince him to give me an interview. He was supposed to become the leader of Al-Qaeda. He was educated for that goal, really. But he left his father. And suddenly, in the middle of the discussion with him before the interview, I see a mail I'm getting from the United States, from the ADL, the Anti-Defamation League, and they said to me, "You got the Daniel Pearl Award." And it was like bizarre. And for a second, I thought maybe it could be the opposite. It could be Daniel Pearl having the Henrique Cymerman Award. And it was sad and it was happy at the same time. And then I went to the States and it was amazing.
What a surreal moment to be interviewing someone like Osama bin Laden's son, the younger bin Laden, in Qatar, to receive the Daniel Pearl Award when you go back to think of Daniel Pearl's story and the fact that he was murdered by Khalid Sheikh Mohammed, who is the third in command of Al-Qaeda, of bin Laden. For you to receive such an award at a time when you're interviewing his son, who's to be the next leader of Al-Qaeda, that must have been a real surreal feeling inside. It must have created a mix of emotions, not just, obviously extreme pleasure to be bestowed with that honor, but I'm trying to understand, what do you say to Mr. bin Laden across from you when you receive such an award?
Well, it was amazing because I was supposed to moderate a meeting of the UN in Qatar some months afterwards. And I wanted to bring bin Laden's son there to say to the world he's against terror. And I convinced him. And it was amazing. And then I told him, I just got the Daniel Pearl Award. He said, oh, poor guy, Daniel Pearl. He knew the story, He said, poor guy, they killed him. And the guy, I think that really Omar bin Laden became someone who was very clear in his opposition to any kind of violence. That's why he left his father when he was 21. But finally, he couldn't come to the UN because the UN people didn't want a bin Laden. It was too early yet, I think, a bin Laden to speak there. Maybe in the future it will happen.
I want just to wrap up this bin Laden story, because I find it so fascinating and intriguing before we move on to other topics. Peter Bergen in the 90s was the first to interview Osama bin Laden for Western media. And when he tells a story of how he actually got to go meet Mr. bin Laden, he went and was put in a vehicle and all of this maneuvering around so he wouldn't know where anything was. When you were in Qatar, did you feel the same way when meeting his son?
Well, almost the same. I don't think it was the same, but because it's a city, it's different. But they said to me, come to this hotel. I arrived, nobody's there. There was a man watching me. And then he called someone. I think Omar told me afterwards, after he moved me from hotel to hotel, he told me that he wanted to be sure that our intention was not to kill him or to attack him, really, because he feels, I think they still feel in a way they are very, very, in a way they are controlled by all the intelligence services that are just following them and seeing what's going on, and their contacts with other people maybe related to Al-Qaeda. The truth is, I don't know if maybe it happened, I don't know why, but 3 weeks afterwards, his father was killed.
The timing is also surreal with the receiving of the award, with this story now, and 3 weeks later, his father in Abu Dhabi, the Navy SEALs Team 6 were able to infiltrate his compound. Today's conversation, we really wanted to focus a little bit more about the role media can play in bridging the gaps between religions, and specifically when it comes to conflict. You've written a very interesting book, Voices from the Center of the World, the Arab-Israeli conflict told by its protagonists. You've also interviewed, very interestingly, again, surreal moment, 24 hours before his assassination, former Prime Minister Yitzhak Rabin. You've interviewed Yitzhak Shamir, a Prime Minister before him who's on the opposite spectrum of politics. You've interviewed the leaders of Islamic Jihad, people within Hamas. You have interviewed collaborators, as what the Palestinians call them, people working with the Israeli secret services. You've really gotten down to the nitty-gritty. You've also interviewed people from around the world, Mahmoud Abbas, and the last couple years as well as Pope Francis. And in there you have a spectrum of secular personnel. You have people in there that are very staunch religious, be it Jewish, Christian, or Muslim. And before we get into your tale a little bit with Pope Francis, I wanted to ask you, having all that vast experience, all that knowledge of where each person's point of view is coming from, and you're really a middleman with all the information coming in from all ends. One thing Shamir will tell you will be very different than Sheikh Yassin would tell you.
Absolutely.
And having sat in the middle and getting all of that information, does the media have a role in bridging the gap in specifically, let's say, the Israeli-Arab conflict, where it has turned into a civilization conflict, where you're now a religious conflict? It is not just territorial. It is very much a civilization conflict, a conflict of religions, which is sad when you think about the fact that both religions stem from the exact same beginning. And we can consider each other cousins from that perspective. In your opinion, what role does the media have to bridge that gap and help solve this conflict?
Look, that's a very personal thing, because in a way it's clear, and that's for everyone, that having a TV camera or having a computer is having a weapon, sometimes a lethal weapon. And I believe that some of the media, some of the Western media, mainly European and South American, didn't understand that since the year 2000, since the Second Intifada, since trouble started again after almost a decade of negotiations and a lot of hope. since violence came back, you know, the suicide bombers, you know, the Israeli attacks in the West Bank and in Gaza, and I think the coverage was very, very poor in a way. And that's one important point, which is, I think, common for all of the journalists. We must be aware we have weapons in our hands, and in a way, we can be part of a media war also when we are covering a conflict. So we must be very, very sensitive. But at the same time, in my role, in my personal role, I had it very clear that in any chance I had to, I don't want to say to bridge, but maybe to bring together, to bring closer the parts in conflict, I felt an obligation to do it. And I did it. And I'm still doing it.
It's a life's mission. It's a life's work. It's not something that can be accomplished overnight. And you were mentioning now the ability for the media to it's a weapon. The media is a weapon. How they cover a story will reflect how the public's opinion is of that story. And now I want to ask you a more general question, not necessarily personal in your opinion, but your opinion on the matter. The Charlie Hebdo attacks that happened, there was a lot of controversy, specifically at that time, about the use of the word terrorist, Islamic extremists. A lot of people called them criminals and gunmen, and there was controversy, war even, between the media outlets on what to refer to these acts of terror. And I want to ask you, the use of the word terror, Islamic extremism, in your opinion, are some media outlets correct in saying that they don't want to use those terms as it perpetuates a cycle of violence, perpetuates a stigma against certain people that it shouldn't be? Or should we be calling these situations as they are, acts of terror perpetrated by Islamic terrorists? It is not that all of Islam is a terrorist, but these specific fundamentalists are using the religion as their guise. What is your opinion on that?
Absolutely. I think you gave the right answer here. We must not be afraid of calling things as they are. And if they are terrorism, if they mean attacks against people who are really innocents, who are civilians, who just were there by chance or by lack of chance, we should call it like that. And that's something that I say, as you know, I teach here in the IDC, but I give also many lectures abroad, and I criticize some of my colleagues and some of the media in Europe mainly in a very open way. I tell them you are wrong when you don't want to call it as it is. It's a fact. It's terror. So go and deal with it. And I don't think that means that every Muslim becomes a terrorist. Not at all. I'm doing now a series for TV, for Israel and for abroad, of 4 hours about the world jihad. And I'm meeting many people all over the world, really, really, who were there in the critical moments, who still are, some of them, in ISIS, in Al-Qaeda, in the Islamic Jihad, in Palestinian groups also, in others. And you really see what's going on, and you really see who they are, and you really see that they are a small minority, a very dangerous small minority. So I think if we want to you're going to ask me about the Pope. That's something I speak a lot with the Pope. If we want to defeat these guys who bring, a really fascist way of seeing the world, we must not be afraid of calling them terrorists, because that's what they do for a living.
And if we mustn't be afraid to call them terrorists, and let's say we learn the lessons and we begin to call them terrorists, what are the ramifications, in your opinion? Because you have the other side of the argument that it was very interesting on the BBC. There was a controversy not too long ago because they have a strict policy of using the words terrorism, Islamic terrorism. And they just interviewed Tzipi Livni, and they had no problem putting her on the spot and asking her about her parents potentially being terrorists. How does that frame the public's opinion on whatever the subject matter is? So now the public, after the Charlie Hebdo attacks happen, how do they look at the Charlie Hebdo attacks? Do they see it as a terrorist attack? Do they see it as an attack on French democracy, on French liberty? Do they see it as an attack on the West as a whole, on Europe? Or do they just see it as a crime? And is that because of the media?
I think they believe it more and more. that we're talking about terrorism. But in a way, some people, they were kidnapped by political, how do you say, to become political correct, They are really kidnapped by this concept, by this way of seeing things. And I think that today, 2015, when you see what's going on in the Middle East, when you see what's going on in Europe, when you see that thousands of Europeans went to Syria, as I saw with my own eyes, to Syria and to Iraq to fight for something that they call jihad, the holy war, and that some of them will go back to Europe maybe in the next future. I believe that the near future, I believe that Europeans should be, should not be so close to this political correctness. And they should think that something happened in the world in the last 15 years.
One last question on this subject before we move on to our next little topic here. Dr. Boaz Ganon teaches here at the IDC as well, has come out and is a staunch advocate that we need a proper internationally recognized definition for the word terrorism. How much help would that be to your profession in the media as an author, as a journalist, not only to yourself, but to the entire world of the media, if you will, that there be an internationally recognized definition? Dr. Ganor says there needs to be a political motivation, needs to be violence, and there needs to be against civilian targets. That is his definition of terrorism and should be adopted internationally. What is your opinion on the need for the definition, and how much would that help your profession?
I think we should. I think we should have at least a debate, an international debate on these matters, because it's really vital. It became one of the main matters, maybe together with the economic crisis. These are the two pillars of the media work today in the world, the two main things, terror and maybe economy. So we should bring together journalists from all over the world and discuss. Maybe we're not going to agree in some of the topics, but maybe we will with others. And we should do something else also. A very important Spanish judge called Baltasar Garzón, a very well-known international judge really today, he used to be the first who defined bin Laden as a threat in the 90s and who tried to bring him to trial a lot of time before 9/11, he told me once, I think one of the things we should do maybe in the UN, maybe in other international organizations, is a kind of an agreement about the rights and the obligations of a journalist, to protect journalists. Too many journalists in the last years were killed because they were journalists doing their job. And there should be a legal protection for them also. So I believe these two things should be done. A discussion, like Professor Ganor said, about the concept of terrorism and terrorists, but also how to protect journalists and to avoid more killings like we saw in the last years, unfortunately.
A perfect segue, because that is my next real question for you. Is you have been in so many conflicts and seen so many things. What is the journalist's role in covering a war zone, in covering a conflict? When you enter, let's say, Iraq, is the role to show the world what is happening to the civilians? Is it to show what's happening with the American forces advancing, or the Iraqi forces, or the insurgents? What role does the journalist have in the middle of a conflict? Let's take Operation Protective Edge 2014 in Gaza last year. What role does the journalist have inside Gaza? Is it to portray the civilian casualties? Is it to portray what's going to happen to Israel or what is happening, or is it to Hamas? It's very interesting to know what each journalist focuses on.
I don't think there is clear answer to that question, and I'll tell you why. Because there is a huge difference. I've been recently in North Iraq with the Peshmerga, the Kurdish army fighting against ISIS. I've been in the front with them for some days. And at the same time, I'm here. And I'm Israeli, by the way, and I'm Jewish, and I live here. And in this place, you have the highest number of journalists per square meter in the world. But there, I didn't see a journalist during 5 days. So that's a huge difference. Here I expect from a journalist to bring something more than hard news, than saying this happened and that happened. I believe we should give a voice to the two sides of a conflict in a fair way. I don't believe in objectivity, but I believe in honesty. So we should, and I think that one of the problems, of the main problems in the coverage of Israel in the last 15 years since the beginning of the Second Intifada, is there was a lack of honesty in the way of covering this conflict, because of many reasons we could discuss. It's an issue for a seminar here and not for an interview. But I think that today something is happening. We should demand a coverage which is more honest, if not objective. When we go to places like Iraq, or like I've been also for some days in a Syrian refugee camp, Al-Zatari, in the border with Jordan, which I was, I think, one of the only journalists at that time there, it's completely different. You get whatever you can, and you're able to, and wherever you go, and this is like a dark place that you bring some light to, and that you try to show to the world what's going on. And there is a big, huge story going on there. I believe that the Middle East is changing as we speak. I believe we are seeing new coalitions, new dangers, but also new possibilities in the Middle East. We are going to see in these 4.5 years of revolutions in the Arab world, we are going to see in the next years completely different things. I think we are in the 4th chapter of a book with 25 chapters. And we are going to see lots of dramas in that story. And I believe we're going to see a change of maps, of the lines, of the borders between different countries. We are going to see, for instance, in Syria and in Iraq, and maybe a balkanization of those areas with microstates being created, maybe Shiites with Shiites, Sunnites with Sunnites, and maybe a Kurdistan, an independent Kurdistan being created in the next years. Who knows? That's what I believe it will happen. And I believe that Israel, as a threatened country by some of these groups, must be very careful, but it's not enough to protect itself. Israel should speak with those who are ready to speak with Israel today in the Middle East. And there are many Sunnite pragmatic countries, I don't like to call them moderate, that today are looking for a coalition with Israel. And I meet them. I meet Saudis, I meet people from the Emirates, even from Qatar, from Morocco, from Egypt, and they tell me, always tell me, we shouldn't lose this opportunity because we have the same fears Israel has. One of them is the Islamic radical groups, mainly ISIS today, which is the big demon for many of them and the big threat. And the second is Iran, the possibility of a threshold state, Iran, which is a threat, first of all, for many countries in the Arab world and in the Gulf.
We are running out of time, but I don't want to bypass this, as I found it to be one of the more interesting portions, and we'll tie it back to our original portion of our discussion on how religion media can potentially bridge the gaps of conflict. You had the honor of going into the Santa Marta to interview Pope Francis, one of the only, if only, if I'm not mistaken, person to ever go in and interview the Pope in their home, their guest home, their residence. This was arranged for you by Rabbi Skolka. Very interestingly, your daughter's wedding landed on the same day as the interview, and it was postponed with the blessings of the Pope. Very, very wonderful, and another surreal moment for you to have in a very long line of wonderful moments. You interviewed the Pope. Very nice, long interview to be aired the next month here in Israel on Channel 2. And you were pulled aside by the Pope, and he says to you, how can I help the Israeli-Palestinian conflict? First of all, what goes through your mind after interviewing the Pope in his residence, the only person to ever do such a thing, and then to have him pull you aside off camera and ask you your opinion on how he can help the Palestinian-Israeli conflict?
Well, it was after the first interview, but it was also after the first lunch, I believe. Rabbi Skorka, the Pope, me and my crew. And then he said, I want to talk alone, no cameras. And we were standing for 1.5 hours, Rabbi Skorka, the Pope, and me. And he said, what can I do for Israel and for the Middle East? And I said to him, come, please come. And then I thought for a second, quite crazy, the Pope asking me, what can he do for the Middle East? And I was surprised. But then, when you are in the middle of that situation, you don't think too much. You do, and you react. And he said to me, "And would you help me to organize this visit?" And I said, "Pope Francis, I don't think you need my help, but I'm available. And I didn't know what would happen afterwards. It was dozens of mails, many telephones, many calls to my mobile directly from the Pope. The first time he called me, he said to me, "Hello, Enrique, I'm Papa Francisco." And I said, I thought it was a friend of mine just making a joke. And I wanted to answer, "Yes, yes, and I'm Napoleon," but I didn't. It was good because I understood it was him. And since then, he called me many times. Look, this is a very special person. First of all, he's a very good friend of the Jewish people. And he's really a remarkable human being. I've been in contact with him for 2 years, more than 2 years now, and I spoke with him many hours. I've been in his small apartment in Santa Marta for 45 minutes talking with him recently. No cameras, it was like an off-the-record conversation. I know he wants to change the world in a way, and he's very worried with the Middle East also, and also with the Christians in the Middle East, and also with violence and with radicalism. He's not afraid of talking about terrorists. He says it clearly. They are terrorists when he speaks about ISIS. And he's thinking about ways of defeating them, not as a military man, because he's not, but defeating them in the ideas point of view, to try to approve all kind of countermeasures that would bring to the Muslim and to the Jewish youth in the world, Muslim here in the Middle East, but also in Europe, different values of tolerance, values of dialogue. And he's thinking about many things. And I can tell you, he asked some of his friends to help him also in this kind of projects. And I think he believes he has something like 5 years to leave something in this world and to change something. Recently, this week, he was in South America and he spoke about hunger and how to finish what he calls the shame of hunger for millions and millions of human beings. So that's another thing he's going to invest in. And if you see, it's not only theological Catholic things. And many times, I believe his best friend is a rabbi. And that says a lot about him. And we spoke a lot about that. And he said to me, "Look, for me, anti-Semitism is a sin. So that's why I'm doing what I'm doing, and I hope to change also my people." And I believe he's also very aware about Holocaust, and he wants to open the archives of the Holocaust in the near future, which is going to be another huge revolution. And I believe he's only in the beginning.
He's a very, very interesting man. Clearly, he also said within every Christian there's a Jew, and that's why anti-Semitism is a sin as well. Speaking in South America, it's very interesting. He's from Argentina, is the first South American pope as well, so going down there brings a lot of hope and joy to a lot of people over there. But you mentioned he wants to fight an idea with an idea, and it's very easy to defeat people militarily with the right weapons and the right tactics. You can defeat people militarily very easily, but it's very hard to kill an idea, and it's a very noble path he's taking to try to destroy the ideology of the haters, if you will, of the world that we live in today. One last question for you as we wrap everything up. The Pope bestowed upon you one last honor. It was the Angel of Peace token. How did that come about? How did that personally make you feel to receive such an honor from Pope Francis, who's not now just any pope, but he's also become maybe a friend of yours a little bit, and to receive such an honor from him, how does that make you feel, and put into perspective what that is going to do for you down the road in the future?
Shimon Peres used to say that awards, he told me personally, awards, they are like a perfume. It's good to smell. It's better not to drink. and that's a little bit how I feel. But I'm really honored, because the moment he told me, "I want to tell you that you are my angel of peace," I thought he was joking, because he's very funny. And I was almost laughing. But then I saw he has something to give me. And he said, "But I want to do it in front of the cameras." And so he said, "For me, you were the angel of peace," because we helped him to organize this ceremony in the Vatican with President Abbas and with President Perez and with him, which was very, very hard work to do it. So we did it, and he wanted to give me this, recognizing my work and my help, and he gave me that, and I was moved, and I was really happy for that.
It's an amazing story. Thank you so much for being here and taking the time to be with us. I want to make sure everyone knows Voices from the Center of the World, the Arab-Israeli conflict told by its protagonist, its author, Henrique Cymerman, joining us here in studio at IDC International Radio. It has been translated into several languages. Yeah. Where can people go purchase this book, as it's an excellent read and they must?
Well, I think at this moment in Amazon, it's the easier way to get it.
All right, you heard it, ladies and gentlemen. Amazon.com or wherever you live, whatever the .uk or .ca it be. Thank you very much, Mr. Cymerman. It's truly a pleasure. All the best to you in your future endeavors, and we hope to see you continue to achieve wonderful things and maybe bring some peace to the Middle East.
Let's hope.